You won't believe what people were forced to endure in ancient Rome. The stories you've heard might be chilling, but the truth is even more terrifying. Torture methods used by the Romans were as brutal as they were creative, some so horrific that just hearing about them could send a shiver down your spine. What if I told you that these methods didn't just break bodies, they shattered souls, leaving scars that never healed? Stay with me, because we're about to go deep into the darkest corners of Roman history, methods of torture that still haunt us to this day. But here's the twist. These weren't just for criminals. Some of these techniques were used on the innocent, on warriors, and even on the elite. So get ready. This is going to get intense. The Roman Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations the world has ever known for its military dominance, its rich culture, and its innovative achievements in law and architecture. But beneath all the grandeur and glory, there was a much darker side to Roman society, a side defined by unimaginable cruelty and terror. While Rome may have created some of the most awe-inspiring works of art, law, and infrastructure, it was also home to some of the most brutal, horrific punishments ever devised. Punishment in ancient Rome wasn't just a form of correction. It was a calculated means of terror, a warning to anyone who dared to defy the empire. People didn't simply face punishment in Roman law. They faced torment beyond imagination. Imagine being caught in the clutches of Rome's legal system. You could be a soldier, a slave, a senator, or even royalty. If you crossed a wrong person or broke the law, you were at the mercy of a punishment that could break your body and shatter your mind. The tortures we're about to explore weren't just about enforcing the law. They were about asserting power. They were a way to remind everyone that Rome was absolute, its power unchallengeable, and its vengeance unrelenting. This is the brutal reality of what it meant to be at the mercy of Rome. So let's step into the shadows of history and uncover the most terrifying, spine-chilling methods of punishment ever known. Ancient Rome's legal system was far more than just a series of rules. It was a weapon used to control, manipulate, and break down anyone who defied the empire. The Romans believed that fear was the most effective tool for maintaining order. Punishments weren't simply carried out behind closed doors. They were spectacles, meant to humiliate and terrify the public. To the Romans, justice was about power, dominance, and absolute control. Every punishment, every execution was a lesson, a warning to everyone that the consequences of defying Rome would be catastrophic. And what better way to make an example out of someone than to break them physically and mentally? The aim wasn't just to punish. It was to send a message that no one, no matter their status, was safe in the wrath of the empire. Even the mightiest generals and the wealthiest senators could be reduced to nothing in the face of Roman justice. It didn't matter who you were, what power you held, or how important you thought you were. If you crossed Rome, you would face horrors beyond your imagination. Torture Method 1, the breaking wheel. Let's start with one of the most terrifying forms of punishment used in ancient Rome, the breaking wheel. This was not just a form of execution. It was a public display of suffering that sent shockwaves through the empire. Imagine this. Your body is tied to a massive wooden wheel, arms and legs bent and broken, your body twisted into unnatural positions. The victim's limbs would be broken by an executioner using a heavy iron bar. It wasn't just about breaking bones. It was about breaking the spirit. The executioner would methodically destroy each joint, each bone, in a slow, agonizing process. But the pain didn't stop there. The victim wasn't simply left to die quickly. No, they were left on the wheel as a public display. The Romans didn't want a quick death. They wanted a drawn-out, painful, humiliating process. It wasn't just about punishment. It was a spectacle designed to break the victim's will. Imagine being in that position, feeling every bone snap, every muscle tear, and knowing that the pain wouldn't end until the crowds had watched you suffer for hours, maybe even days. The victim's body, shattered and exposed, would serve as a reminder to the people that Rome's justice was absolute and brutal. Torture Method 2, the strappado. Next, we have a strappado, a form of torture that was as mentally tormenting as it was physically excruciating. The victim's hands would be tied behind their back, and they would be hoisted into the air by a rope or chain. The victim would be left hanging, suspended by their own arms, their entire body weight pulling down on their shoulders, wrists, and arms. The strappado was designed to inflict intense pain on the joints, often dislocating the victim's shoulders and causing the body to go into shock. But the worst part wasn't just the agony of being suspended. It was the uncertainty, the helplessness. The victim never knew when the pain would end, how long they would be left to suffer, or when they would be released from their torment. To make matters worse, sometimes weights would be added to the victim's feet, causing even more pressure on the joints. It wasn't just the physical pain that made the strappado so horrific. It was a psychological torture of knowing that death could come any moment, and yet you couldn't escape the agonizing torture that was slowly wearing you down. Torture method 3, the rack. The rack was one of the most feared torture devices in Roman history. This device wasn't just designed to kill. It was designed to break the human spirit. The victim would be strapped to a large wooden frame, with their arms and legs stretched in opposite directions. The executioner would turn a wheel, gradually pulling the victim's limbs in different directions, slowly tearing muscles, cracking bones, and dislocating joints. Every moment was pure agony, as the body was forced beyond its natural limits. What made the rack so terrifying wasn't just excruciating pain. It was a knowledge that death could be a slow process. The victim could be stretched for hours or even days, their body being torn apart piece by piece. The emotional toll was just as severe as the physical pain. The victim was subjected to a constant state of fear, wondering when the pain would stop, when death would come, or they would survive long enough to escape the torment. And what made this form of torture even more cruel was that it wasn't just for criminals. Sometimes, the rack was used to extract confessions, and many people, guilty or innocent, would confess to crimes just to stop the pain. It was a method of control as much as it was punishment. Torture method 4, the Damnatio ad bestias. Another brutal punishment used in ancient Rome was the Damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts. This was a form of execution where prisoners, criminals, or even slaves were thrown into the arena to face wild animals, lions, tigers, and even bears. The animals weren't just used for a quick kill. They were released into the arena to tear apart the victims slowly, often maiming them before delivering the final blow. The fear of knowing you would soon be torn apart by these creatures was terrifying enough on its own, but the cruelty of this punishment was that the victim's fate wasn't immediate. The crowd would watch as the victims struggled to defend themselves, knowing full well that they were no match for the animals. Some victims would be torn apart limb by limb, while others might be forced to fight for their lives for an agonizing amount of time. The terror of the unknown, when death would come, how it would come, was enough to break even the bravest of souls. Torture method 5, the flaying. Flaying, the act of skinning someone alive, was one of the most horrific punishments in Roman history. The victim would be tied down, and their skin would be slowly and methodically removed, often starting with the feet or hands and working upward. This method wasn't just painful. It was designed to strip the victim of their humanity, to reduce them to nothing but a broken, lifeless shell. This wasn't a punishment meant to be quick. It was a drawn-out, agonizing process that could last for hours, leaving the victim in excruciating pain before they finally succumbed to shock, blood loss, or infection. Flaying wasn't just about physical pain. It was about psychological torture as well. The victim's body was exposed, their skin peeled away until they were nothing but raw flesh. This punishment was often carried out in public, as a spectacle, meant to show the people of Rome just how absolute their power was. Torture method 6, the burning. Another horrific form of Roman execution was burning. The victim would be tied to a stake, and their body would be covered in flammable materials. The flames would start small, but they would quickly grow, burning away the flesh and causing the victim unbearable pain. The horror of being burned alive was not just the excruciating pain. It was the slow, suffocating nature of the torment. The victim would feel their flesh burning away, but the death wasn't immediate. The agony would last for a long time, and the smoke would choke them, making it impossible to breathe. The terror of burning alive wasn't just about the pain. It was about the knowledge that death could take hours, a slow, agonizing process that made the victim's final moments nothing short of hell. Torture method 7, the sawn in half. One of the most gruesome forms of punishment used by the Romans was the act of being sawn in half. This form of execution was usually reserved for the worst criminals, such as traitors or enemies of the state. The method involved the victim being tied to a post or a large wooden frame, often in an upright position. The executioner would then use a large, serrated saw to cut through the victim's body, starting at the lower part of the body and working upward. This was not a quick death. The victim would experience excruciating pain as the saw slowly cut through their flesh, bone, and organs. The pain would be so intense that the victim would often lose consciousness, only to be revived and subjected to more agony. The execution would take a long time, with the victim's body being slowly and methodically cut in half. It was a painful and drawn-out process, designed not just to kill, but to break the victim's will and send a message to the public. The act of being sawn in half was also a spectacle, a public execution meant to show the power and ruthlessness of Rome. It wasn't just about punishing the victim. It was about turning their death into a gruesome display for all to witness. For those watching, it was a reminder that rebellion, treason, and disobedience were met with the most horrific consequences imaginable. Torture Method 8. The red-hot iron. Another terrifying method of punishment used by the Romans was the use of red-hot irons. This form of torture was often used on slaves, criminals, and those suspected of treason. A large iron would be heated until it was glowing red, and then it would be pressed against the victim's skin. The heat from the iron would cause the skin to burn and blister immediately, and the pain would be so intense that it could lead to shock or unconsciousness. The Romans used this method to leave permanent marks on the victim's body, often branding them with a symbol or marking them with a scar that would last for the rest of their lives. This was not just a form of physical torture. It was a method of marking the victim as a criminal or slave, a permanent reminder of their offense. Branding was also a psychological form of torture. The victim would have to live with the knowledge that their body bore the marks of their punishment for the rest of their life. It wasn't just about pain. It was about humiliation and the constant reminder of the consequences of crossing the Romans. The scars from the red-hot iron were permanent and visible, making sure that no one ever forgot the victim's crime. Torture Method 9. The cross of shame. In addition to crucifixion, which we'll discuss later, another form of public humiliation was the cross of shame. This was a form of punishment in which the victim would be tied to a wooden cross in a public place, often in a busy area where many people could see. The victim would be left there for hours, sometimes even days, exposed to the elements, and often left without food or water. The idea behind this punishment wasn't just to cause pain. It was to humiliate the victim in front of the entire community. The victim would be helpless, exposed, and completely at the mercy of the elements and the crowds. Often, the public was invited to mock the victim, throw stones, or shout insults. This form of public shaming was used to ensure that the victim would be forever remembered as someone who defied Roman law. Unlike crucifixion, which was a more formalized and fatal punishment, the cross of shame was often used as a way to humiliate people who had committed lesser crimes or as a precursor to more severe punishments. It was a way of showing that no one was safe from public disgrace. In many cases, the victim would eventually be taken down from the cross and subjected to further punishment, including execution. Torture Method 10. The pillory. The pillory was another form of public humiliation used in ancient Rome. This punishment involved the victim being placed in a wooden frame, with their head and hands locked into place. The victim would be forced to stand in this humiliating position for hours or even days, exposed to the ridicule of the public. People would often throw food, mud, and other objects at the victim. It wasn't just about physical pain. It was about stripping away the victim's dignity. The pillory was often used for people who had committed minor offenses, like stealing or insulting a Roman citizen. But the humiliation wasn't just about the crime. It was about making persons suffer in front of the community. Being forced to stand in the pillory for hours on end, unable to move or defend themselves, was a fate worse than physical torture for many. It was a punishment that broke the spirit, making the victim a spectacle for everyone to see. In some cases, the victim might be released after a period of time, but the damage to their reputation was irreversible. The public humiliation would follow them for the rest of their lives, and they would forever be marked as a criminal. Even after they were freed, they would remain an outcast in Roman society. Torture Method 11. The boot. The boot, or the leg-breaking device, was a particularly gruesome form of punishment used by the Romans to punish slaves or enemies of the state. The victim's foot was placed inside a metal device that gradually constricted, crushing the bones in the foot, breaking it into pieces. This was not a quick process. The device would slowly tighten, breaking the bones over a period of time. The physical pain was excruciating, but the psychological terror of being trapped in the boot was just as torturous. The victim would know that with each tightening of the boot, they were closer to permanent injury or death. The boot was often used as a form of interrogation, with the victim being forced to answer questions or reveal information about their co-conspirators in exchange for relief. It was a slow, agonizing form of torture designed to break the victim both physically and mentally. As with other forms of Roman punishment, the aim was not just to inflict pain, but to instill fear in others by demonstrating how ruthlessly the Romans would go to control those they deemed enemies. Torture Method 12, the Crucifixion, perhaps the most infamous of all Roman torture methods, was crucifixion. Although it was not exclusive to Rome, it became synonymous with Roman brutality and was one of the most public and humiliating forms of punishment in the empire. Crucifixion was often reserved for the worst criminals, particularly those who were seen as a threat to the stability of the empire, such as traitors, slaves who rebelled, and pirates. The victim would be stripped naked, and nails would be driven into their hands and feet, pinning them to a cross. The cross would be raised into the air, and the victim would be left to hang there for hours, sometimes days, as they slowly suffocated and bled to death. The pain from the nails, the exposure to the elements, and the slow, agonizing process of dying were all designed to break the victim's spirit. The worst part of crucifixion wasn't just a physical agony. It was a humiliation. The Romans made sure that crucifixion was as public as possible. The victim would be displayed for all to see, exposed to mockery, insults, and pain. It was a method meant to deter others from committing crimes against the Roman state. The Roman executioners were experts in prolonging death, ensuring that the victim suffered for as long as possible. It was a public, terrifying reminder of what happened to those who dared defy the power of Rome. Torture Method 13, the poison cup, though it was often seen as a more silent form of punishment. Poisoning was used by the Romans for those who were seen as a threat to the empire, especially among the political elite. Poisoning wasn't just about death. It was about the slow, agonizing process of losing control over one's body as the poison took its effect. Roman emperors were often poisoned by rivals, and emperors would also use poison as a tool to eliminate threats to their rule. The poison would slowly weaken the victim, causing symptoms that were sometimes visible only after a period of time, leading to confusion and a sense of helplessness. This form of punishment often involved poisoning a victim's food or drink, making it impossible for them to know the exact moment when their life would end. The process could last days as the victim's body slowly deteriorated from within. The fear of being poisoned, the uncertainty of when it would strike, was a terror that haunted many, especially in the brutal political world of Rome. Torture Method 14, the salted wounds. One of the most unimaginable forms of torture was the practice of salting open wounds. This method was used to prolong suffering and cause intense pain. After inflicting deep cuts or wounds on the victim's body, the Romans would pour salt directly into the open wounds. The salt would cause intense burning, aggravating the injury and causing severe pain. The victim would be left in agony, sometimes for hours, while the salt slowly irritated their wounds, making it nearly impossible to move or escape the pain. This form of torture was both physically brutal and psychologically tormenting, as the victim could do nothing but endure the excruciating burn. Salting wounds was often used to punish those who had committed crimes against Roman authority. It was designed not only to inflict physical damage, but also to degrade the victim in the eyes of the public. It wasn't just about pain. It was about showing the world the consequences of defying the Roman state. Torture Method 15, the lethal beating. The Roman soldiers were infamous for their brutal training and their willingness to punish disobedience through lethal force. The lethal beating was a method used by Roman soldiers to punish disobedient slaves, criminals, and even enemies. The victim would be beaten repeatedly by several soldiers until they were either severely injured or dead. It was a punishment designed to crush the spirit, as the victim could never know when the beating would end. The beating would be relentless, with the victim being struck with fists, clubs, and other weapons, leaving the person broken both physically and mentally. The terror of knowing that the beating could go on for hours, with no escape or mercy, was a fate worse than death for many. When we look back at ancient Rome, We often think of its glory, the vast empire, its incredible engineering feats, and its lasting influence on the world. But buried beneath the grandeur was a terrifying side to Roman society, a side where fear was used as a tool of power, and cruelty was the price paid for defying the empire. The punishments we've explored were not just about justice. They were about control, dominance, and spectacle. They were designed to make people fear the power of Rome, to break them physically and mentally, and to show the world that defying Roman law came at the cost of unimaginable suffering. These tortures were public, terrifying, and unrelenting. The messages they sent were clear. Rome's justice was swift, brutal, and unyielding. Anyone who dared challenge it would face horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What's truly chilling is how these methods weren't just reserved for criminals. The might of Rome stretched beyond the battlefield and into every corner of life, crushing the innocent just as easily as it crushed the guilty. It didn't matter who you were. Once you were caught in the grip of Roman justice, your fate was sealed. While the empire eventually fell, its legacy of fear and cruelty is still felt in the pages of history. The stories of these tortures remain etched in time, not only as a reminder of Rome's brutal past, but also as a reflection of the darker side of power that transcends time. If you found this journey through the horrors of ancient Rome chilling, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more unsettling stories from history that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The past may be gone, but its shadows remain with us, lurking in the corners of our understanding. Stay curious, stay aware, and never stop questioning. Thanks for watching.